And we've begun. The big question, when? Tuesday or Thursday next week for the exam?
Thursday.
Thursday. It's unanimous. What was wrong with Tuesday?
I have an economics exam.
Of course. Sure.
She does too, it's not just me.
Sure.
Yeah, I do too.
I was stressing.
Okay.
And we have it right before this class.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's horrible. Yeah, I understand everybody. I'm low maintenance when it comes to that. We're gonna get the exams in one way or the other. So I mean, it's. I've reached a certain point in my life where a day here, a day there, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. I'm happy to be with it. I'm in a good mood tonight because the Steelers. God, not great, but fun. So news I didn't get to sleep till about 2 o'clock, and the game didn't end till midnight. Poor dog is just like, I gotta go to bed. What is going on? It's not fair, and you can't do that when you're a dog. You just can't. Let's see. Is this the dog picture of the day? Yep, this is it. The dog is this one. I'm on the other side. I can see the resemblance, except he's got a lot of hair. It's a very cute dog. Not a nice face. He's all right as dogs go. Okay, so we're going to dedicate at least a starting point of today. For you late arrivals, we're doing the exam on Thursday. Okay, so and we'll do now. What I typically do with the exam is I will record and send to you, probably as a YouTuber, when I do it, and some juncture in the next couple of days, a study guide, basically like a review. The way I do it is I kind of am like talking you through the test, so it should be of some assistance in that regard. It's really only 2 chapters. I mean, 2 sections. It's got the the nervous system chapter, which is 13, and then the endocrine chapter is 15. We'll probably start blood a little bit today, and that is not on. That goes in the next unit. Blood goes over with blood, and heart and blood vessels are kind of the next go round. Then it's immune, and then it's the other stuff. It's all there. That's all the news fit to print. With regard to that, this is off. Nobody will be annoying me. Hope. And let us go back to this PowerPoint. So it's here. Effectively, if you're going to be in the healthcare tree in any way, shape, or form, you've got to be familiar with diabetes. And most of it boils down to this organ, the pancreas, particularly the endocrine function. Okay, the exocrine function is something we'll examine toward the latter portion of the term in digestive, which is very important. But the early portion of it here is the endocrine portion. And so we won't talk about the acinar cells, which is just a kind of glandular cell that's there. We're going to look at the islets of Langerhans, and they're more on the exterior of the pancreas. Pancreas is a rather unimpressive looking piece of tissue that you might miss pretty easily if you really didn't know, because it's kind of underneath the stomach and sort of curled up into the small intestine. You'll see it when we look at digestive, because technically speaking, that's when we'll evaluate the exocrine portion of it. But you have alpha and beta cells, and interestingly, they're released in very, very close order with each other. And so it's this elegant way of, when we ingest a meal, and most of the time there's some type of carbohydrate or eventual carbohydrate involved, whether it's complex carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates. So whether it's simple sugars that you might have with a snack, a candy bar, whatever you're inclined to snack on, versus a complex carbohydrate where you're having pasta or something along those lines, depending. Okay, it's going to involve the release initially of insulin to address that increase in sugar, so it can be converted satisfactorily to energy, and then at the same time a certain amount of glucagon, which works opposite. If anything, it increases blood sugar. The insulin is going to enhance the ability of those carbohydrates to enter the cell, undergo metabolism and energy transformations, and make ATP. And effectively, if you can use that ATP up, if you haven't used it in about a minute, it's going to start to go through a conversion back into fat. It's kind of the way it works. And that's why the whole dietary input output of roughly, for most of us, around 2,000 calories a day is a very sound way if you're looking at dealing with, so if you're more active, you're going to burn more calories. If you're less active, you're going to burn less calories. You can adjust your eating and your activity. And there's a lot of nuances to it. It goes a little bit in. Do you folks do a nutrition course as part of your, yeah. So, I mean, you may have touched on that a little bit. The way our body works, carbs are favored. Whenever carbs come in, they get metabolized first. When they're used up, then your body turns to fats as an alternative energy source, which is interestingly is more efficient, but it's got more problematic waste products to deal with. And then lastly, proteins. That's kind of the pecking order of how things work, which is the reason behind things like originally South Beach diet, and now that we see the ketogenic diet, which is very, very popular. It's just a hard diet to stay on. I managed to lose almost 50 pounds on it. So I went from about 237 into almost below 180, with that. And this was right before, I'm going to tell you, 2018, 2019, that area. It's hard to stay on with that. And like a lot of diets, it's fairly expensive. And unfortunately, my first love in life, carbs. I'm sorry, it's true. I grew up in the land where the bagel was king. New York metropolitan area, we know from bagels. I mentioned I was raised by a Jewish lady, my mother. And it's a curse in the family, bread and cake. Nevertheless, this is the system that's involved, and understand another thing about carbohydrates, and typically are more often pro-inflammatory. And as you folks get older, that may be of somewhat of a consideration as well. If you're prone to any arthritic changes or inflammatory disorders, there's a lot of nuances to this, to be very honest with you. So that's the jumping off point. What happens? We're trying to keep that sugar, and basically it's a function of sugar utilization. So now there's different ways to evaluate it when we see abnormalities. We have a lot more sophisticated things. We have, everybody's seen it, somebody who'll test their sugar and use a glucometer. It's instantaneous. They even devices that you could implant and be tested continuously, insulin pumps that will adjust for diabetics and give them a certain amount. And I've had two high-level hockey players within the last 12 years who both came in, were insulin dependent diabetics on insulin pumps and playing, interscholastic hockey at a very high level, before they had this whole hockey terrible thing that the previous administration did. But understand that it's understood how to deal with these things. So nevertheless, we can test sugars much more easily than we did years ago. When I started in medicine, these nearly 50 years ago, the way we tested it, you didn't want people were basically, they did urine testing to see if there was excessive sugar and adjusted accordingly with that. It was called a sliding scale. Now we do it with glucometers. And now we have something very new that you may have heard about. Comparative, it's called hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin like that, and then the A1C. It's also known as glycosylated hemoglobin. And so it's really a comparatively new way, when I say new, within the last 15 years, to permit us to monitor not only if someone is a pre-diabetic, but also how well their diabetes is managed, and to be able to monitor it, because it's really measuring how much sugar is being carried around in the hemoglobin. So it's really become a very useful measure. This is a devastating disease. 75% of the people who lose their sight, diabetes. 75% of the people have to have kidney transplants or have to be on dialysis. Guess what? Diabetes. Diabetes, diabetes, diabetes. It ain't easy. So that's kind of where we start with this. So now we have the ability of monitoring blood glucose easily at home. It's a finger stick. It's simple. It's very, very inexpensive. You can keep recordings of those. There's more advanced techniques and all of the above. That's there. So we've really made a lot of strides in this particular disorder. And as you might probably can tell just by the nature of the discussion, I know a lot about it. I'm fortunate that I have never been diagnosed, although there are other people in my family. My maternal grandfather died of complications because he wouldn't take the insulin. He was about 70. That was a long, long time in the early days about that. So they're just showing you a slide of this, and it's not a big deal what's where or anything like that. Okay, glucagon. When you're in fight or flight, that's one of the big players. Your your pancreas releases this, in particularly with the action of the sympathetic nervous system. That's fight or flight. So decreased blood glucose levels or rising amino acid levels. The idea is that maybe you're starting to utilize proteins and releasing amino acids. That suggests that maybe you need to release some sugar from stores. It works almost directly on the liver, and it's called glycogenolysis. Glycogen, you have very limited capability of storing sugar. That's why excessive sugars turn to fat. Only two places, and they're really your emergency stores. They're in the liver and they're in skeletal muscle, and they're there just for that, fight or flight. So you have an ample energy supply to run muscle activity if you have to do something under an extreme duress, whether it's an actual fight, whether it's running away, or dealing with a highly stressful situation. So we outpour sugar, and most of that comes from glucagon. So they break up the glycogen that's principally in the liver, and it's sort of like my analogy for that. After that happens, your body replenishes it relatively quickly. It's almost like the analogy is something in a hospital that you see in an emergency called a crash cart. So if you've ever been, and some of you will, actually see somebody go into what we used to call a code, a cardiac arrest or some crisis, then all of a sudden it goes crazy. And all of a sudden you're doing extraordinary measures to try to keep somebody, and there's two outcomes. Either they're going to be alive or they're going to be dead. There's really no gray zone that's in that. And if you've ever seen what an emergency room looks like, there's stuff everywhere. You're just throwing stuff because you respond as quickly as possible. The very first thing that somebody has to do as soon as that's over, one way or the other, is you have to turn around to somebody and say, reload the crash cart, because you never know when the next one's coming. And so your body does the same thing. It reloads that emergency store of sugar in your skeletal muscles and in your liver in order to deal with it. So, and it's got other ways. Gluconeogenesis is making it from non-carbohydrate bases. And so there's a lot to be said. Where insulin, again, is secreted whenever blood glucose levels rise. So even then, in fight or flight, you're going to secrete some insulin to lower it down. The body does not like sharp turns. Living systems don't do sharp. Living systems do gradual turns, because sharp turns are very, very. And so if you draw a curve, this is the way we used to determine if someone was a diabetic without hemoglobin A1Cs and finger sticks. We do what's called a glucose tolerance test. So the x-axis is time, as it usually is, and this is blood sugar. And the normals are typically, let's say, roughly between 65, and every lab is different, between 110 and what's called milligrams percent, which means you have, let's say, 70 milligrams of sugar in 100 cc's or 100 milliliters of blood. We use percents in this day. Okay. So what happens is you have somebody effectively fast overnight. You take their fasting blood sugar. Let's see where it is. Let's say it's here arbitrarily, and then every half an hour after that, you do a finger stick to monitor their blood sugar. So hour 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and I've seen them go all the way to 7. And effectively, you're monitoring, but in that first interval here, you administer a test load of approximately 100 grams of carbohydrates. So typically, it's like a sweet drink, a cola drink or an orange drink. It's very unpleasant. I've done it. Okay, it's like, ugh, you got to get it down in about 20 minutes. And what it will do is it's going to spike your sugar up, and you want to see if within 2 hours it kind of should look like this. When I mean don't making sharp turns, you don't want to see this kind of event. That's the marriage of insulin and glucagon together. Just to give you some idea. So what happens normally? You grab something to eat on the go because you're just feeling like I need a little boost of energy middle of the afternoon. You know, participating in a Snickers bar kind of moment. Okay. I personally would rather have a Kit Kat. Just me. Just saying. But that's me. Twix bars also. It's the perfect time of year to talk candy. What's coming up? I have there's a neighbor down our street who I tell you he's got 100 inflatables already out there. Looks like there's an invasion from outer space. I'm big into I love candy. You see, I'm a very my oldest granddaughter is now going to be 22. When she was little and living in with us, I was very careful. People are strange. So I'd have to inspect all her candy when she went out trick or treating. I found a high population, of Reese's cups that looked suspicious. And rather than let her have them, I ate them. She always wondered where they went. I said, they look suspicious. I had to eat them. I felt compelled. See, I was being responsible. Sorry. I'd let her have one of those. An occasional Reese's Pieces was okay. Leave it packed, you get one. So it starts off as enzymes and hormones typically are produced in a precursor state and then modified. So what is it? And then it's activated. That's about all you need to know about that. Enhances, and it does multiple things. It's not just about sugar. Glucose does a tremendous amount of things. We understand the pathway pretty well with regard to insulin rather than glucose. It attaches on the outside of the cell. It sets up a chain reaction of not just bringing glucose into the cells, stops the glycogen from being broken down because you don't need it. It's coming into the cells. Doesn't allow protein derivatives or fats, what they call gluconeogenesis, increases bodily repair and cellular metabolism and mitosis, and it utilizes sugar as the energy source, which is the opposite of growth hormone, which does the same thing but utilizes fats as the energy source. So the two of them are always opposed. We tend to slow down growth hormone activity when insulin increases, and when growth hormone activity increases, we slow down insulin activity. So they're like a tug of war between them. And we see that a lot, and it's part of homeostasis. That's there. No need for glucose in the liver, kidney, or brain, okay, because they're automatic. Your brain's always got, and the brain can only tolerate glucose, which brings us to another significant thing. People have a misunderstanding about high sugar and low sugar. I can't even tell you how many diabetics we used to see come in who hadn't taken care of themselves and their sugars were in that 500 to 1,000 milligrams. I mean, unbelievable. They go into something called diabetic coma. They would be almost non-responsive. They would be, acting very, very strangely, and it was scary. It's potentially deadly, but not immediately so. The thing that is much more likely to kill you rapidly is hypoglycemic crisis, having your sugar go below 50. That's really the problem in a lot of diabetics, and I've had patients do this over the years. I got to take my insulin in the morning, and I was running late for work, so I figured I'd grab something as soon as I got to work. And what happens is they don't eat fast enough before the insulin takes effect, and the next thing they know, they black out. And it's just like in the movies. The first thing we do when we have a diabetic comes into emergency room and you have some identifier, whether they have a bracelet or a necklace or something in their wallet, or they're with somebody goes, that's a diabetic. The first thing we do is give them sugar. A lot. Because you can always get sugar down with insulin, okay? But you can't get sugar up unless you give them sugar. And most diabetics have candy bars with them. They have something you can put under their tongue with them, because if they start to feel shaky, and all of a sudden you start to feel. So you get a little tiny warning sign. But a lot of times, if it's unfortunate, they're driving to work, they could end up just blacking out and hitting a tree, or heaven forbid somebody else. Because a lot of times it's just, and it's like in the movies, they give them the sugar. And it's like, where am I? So there's a lot that's involved. So what happens is, yes, it plays a role in all of these things, learning and memory, no question. Tyrosine kinase is the enzyme that's inside the cell, and it's like a chain reaction. When it's activated inside the cell indirectly by glucose, by what's called second messengers, okay, it begins to make ATP. It tends to add to making glucogen. It converts glucose to fat. In adipose tissue, if there's excessive amounts that are available, it does all of those things. Again, increases mitosis, cellular repair, etc., etc. That's that. So elevated blood glucose, certainly number one on the hit parade. Again, if you're ingesting a meal, it's often not just carbohydrates. It's a combination, and most of the time, that's what we have. If you get a sandwich, you're going to have some kind of protein on it. Maybe you're going to have a piece of cheese, so you're going to have some kind of fat on it. Okay, that kind of thing. That's there. So so think of a sandwich as like all three of those things together, or my own personal preference, pizza. Well, you know. So, moving on. So, other things happen. Acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nerves will also trigger it. All of these kinds of things will induce, to some extent, that'll increase insulin. Glucagon will raise sugar, insulin will try to combat that. Epinephrine will simulate fight or flight. Growth hormone, still, because of metabolic activity, will cause an increase of sugar in the bloodstream. Thyroid hormone, glucocorticoids by their name, elevated, because we use them in times of stress. So all of those kinds of things are part of it. And they show you these things, which I don't even go through. So what happens when it's wrong? Any irregularity in sugar utilization that's characterized by consistently irregularities in its utilization and is characterized by increased sugars over normal. Okay, so it depends on what it is. If someone has a fasting blood sugar of 150 or more, they're diabetic. Or if they have, when a test like that, if you do a screening test and you notice that their hemoglobin A1C is elevated or their sugar is elevated significantly over outside the normals, and they'll use generic normals, 60 to 100, 65 to 110, effectively you're likely dealing with a diabetic, but you have to study these things. And there's a lot of different factors that are involved. So and oftentimes when we see irregularities that don't make the cut, so to speak, they become what we call a pre-diabetic. So for years, prior to the modern age, when a woman had gained weight during a pregnancy, there was they used to not monitor that at all. It was like, oh, you gained as much weight. Now we're much more sensitive to it. But we used to see babies that when we saw a baby that was over 10 pounds, now it's over 9 pounds. That's indicative of a potential pre-diabetic. There's things called gestational diabetes, where women become diabetic or appear to be diabetes because of the increased stress levels and steroidal hormones that elevate. That's also a risk factor. If they have a utilization curve where they have something called reactive hypoglycemia, what happens is they eat that candy bar and all of a sudden it's like there's so much insulin that poured out in a regularly large amount that they start to get very, very shaky. But reactive hypoglycemia, that's a risk factor. If you have a parent or a grandparent, that's a risk factor. So all of those classify people as pre-diabetics, and you have to be watchful of all those things. So technically, I would be in that range, but like, again, I haven't tested it, and we'll get to the different types. So effectively, nowadays we refer to them as type 1 and type 2. For years, you used to call them juvenile and adult onset. That's not the case anymore because we see juveniles getting the adult cases the adult type, and we see adults getting the juvenile type. So now we just refer to them as type 1 and type 2, and the classification is based on, is the insulin being made, or the insulin, is it being made? Is it being made and released sufficiently? Is there some inherent problem with the insulin? Would be type 1. Type 2 has to do with, most likely, the receptors. They're on all the shell, so most likely, theoretically, you could have a problem inherently with the way the insulin, like a genetic defect. Most likely, it's a genetic defect on the receptors. That's sort of painting with a broad brush. And for years, when we saw, typically you'd see an insulin dependent young person who had to be very careful. They didn't make enough insulin. They had to be careful and they had to weigh all their meals. They usually had some type, like if they were in school, let's say in high school, they would have some type of documentation in the office, so they would be available. So they would understand if there was a problem, that you had to give them some leeway in what they had to do. That kind of a thing. And you rarely saw the very, let's say, overweight, inactive, very tired appearing type, which we typically associate with maturity onset. We've seen a significant change, and some people call it metabolic syndrome or syndrome X, and that has come about in an age where young people are less active, stuck in front, like all of us are, in front of computers, video games, less activities outside, diets that are sketchy at best, okay, all those types of things. And that has really increased the number of this so-called maturity onset or type 2 in younger people, and it's a big concern. Does it have something to do with are there additives in the food, potentially problems? Some people feel that. It's just a lot of different nuances in the way society has changed with regard to those things. So never being an overly active, but I was never really an inactive kid. I love sport, but I was just terrible at it. What are you gonna do? So what happens? For whatever reason, sugar is not getting into the cells, whether the insulin's not there to open the gateway or the receptors don't work in response to the insulin. So what happens? Now you have too much sugar in the bloodstream. Okay. It becomes what's called an osmotic diuretic. There's so much sugar, okay, that your kidneys can't resorb it. Your kidneys can resorb a blood sugar up to about 185. And that's a really important number, because once you're over that, it really damages the mechanism over time. And so, if anything, the kidneys have even more problems the longer you're over 185. Now, all of a sudden, those receptors are overloaded and they can barely get to 200 or anything like that. So there's really some significant problems associated with it. So what happens is that extra sugar, the way your body compensates for it, is it effectively it pulls water into the urine, so you urinate more, polyuria. Okay, you're losing more water, you're thirsty, polydipsia, and you're hungry because even though your sugar is high in the bloodstream, the cells are starved of an energy resource. Okay, so effectively it's called polyphagia, but those are the three polys: polydipsia, polyuria, polyphagia. And because your energy production is lagging, typically fatigue is associated with it. Those are the big signs that are part of it. And they lead to all sorts of additional problems. You're overloading your kidneys. What happens in the kidneys, and this is one of the theories behind the type 1, is that it is some type of viral disorder that has altered the insulin in such a way that your body responds to it as something that's foreign. And so we'll get to this in the immune system. And what happens is when your body sometimes will make antibodies to products it makes, and they form a complex called an antigen-antibody complex. Your white blood cells gobble that up, if it's gobbleable. If it's not, has a tendency, and the fancy word is precipitate. It settles in certain structures. One of the structures it settles in is the kidney. And that's why we see a lot of end organ problems with regard to the kidney. And so these complexes were typically associated with high blood pressure because they're damaging the kidney, problems associated with the kidney and kidney functioning where it was not being as efficient as it was, and you had high blood sugar. And we used to see these deposits. They had a fancy name called Kimmel-Style-Wilson, and it was named for the disease. Now we think they're autoimmune complexes, and we think that some aspects of insulin-dependent diabetes are your body's really attacking its own insulin for whatever reason. Is there an underlying virus? Possibly. It's associated with that. So there's all sorts of subtle things that go on. So what happens in diabetes, and we call it diabetes mellitus. Again, when you diabetes insipidus or salt diabetes, it involves insufficient amount of antidiuretic hormone. So what does it characterize? High levels of fatty acids. Your body next starts attacking fats. Well, fats, you may or may not have gotten this somewhere. The way the body chops fats, it chops them into little units of 2. And so you have these, you're basically units of acetic acid. And what happens is they slam into each other and they form what are called keto acids. And keto acids are bad. They damage blood vessels. They cause a lot of vascular problems, particularly small blood vessels. And where do we find small blood vessels? In the eye, in the kidney, going into the extremities, which is why we see diabetics having a lot of problems in those areas. Wherever there's wherever blood vessels get smaller. So fingers and toes are at risk of absent circulation. Kidneys, risk of non-functioning, being on dialysis or losing or having to be transplanted if they're amenable to that. Heart problems, eye problems. All part of it. So they form this ketoacidosis. That's part of it from these ketone bodies. And ketonuria, that's something in a ketogenic diet you're trying to induce. Okay, you're trying to make the body utilize fats, but your kidneys have to work well, and you have to push fluids a lot to sort of rinse that stuff out. That's why diabetics generally have to stay away from that particular. You did not know. So what happens now that you have acidity, you have an excessive amount of acidity in your bloodstream, you begin to get what they call hyperpnea, means they breathe rapidly. So diabetics are, and it's very foul smelling, like they went out, they were drunk. And a lot of times diabetics get, the police stop them and cite them with public drunkenness because inherently they have a disease called diabetic peripheral neuropathy where they lose sensation. And at that point, it looks like they're unsteady, like they're out, publicly drunk because they have foul smelling breath, and they find out afterwards they're diabetes, and there's a lot of apologies, but it doesn't stop it from occurring. That's there. So it's got a fancy name. It's called Kussmaul breathing. These are little things to look for. If you have somebody who's known to be a diabetic you're going to be interacting with, and you're getting this, and you're kind of like, ooh, watch out. All of these things are part of it that are there. Certainly, there are cases when we have an excessive amount of insulin leading to hypoglycemia. And again, the disorientation is something that's there. But we can see that, again, as a precursor to diabetics having irregularities in insulin and glucagon release that are all part of it. There's so much there. They don't really go into the peripheral neuropathy here. In my experience, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the individuals lose sensation, okay, and they become very unsteady. I've operated on people without anesthesia and removed bones from their feet and ankles. No anesthesia. Thank you very much. Just to give you an idea of how profound it is. And really, most of the science today points toward, I guess the best way to describe it is early aggressive treatment. And it was up in Boston, out of the big hospitals up there. It was called the Joslin Center, and they had a lot of peripheral clinics that they began to use called the Joslin method. And what they basically said was, we need a multifactorial approach. Family members have to get in touch, make sure you're eating properly, exercising, taking your medicine, keeping your sugar under control aggressively as soon as the diagnosis is made. And it really limits these severe problems that are there. And it's awful. That's there. I'll get to when we get to repro, They may cite it here, but a lot of times people, my grandfather was in a different age back in 1955, who didn't want to take insulin. Insulin was made from pork. I don't know how religious or kosher he was, but maybe that played a role. I just think he didn't want to take the shots that were there. I didn't know him very well. He died when I was 4 years old, so I have very, very vague remembrances of him. But a lot of people are reluctant to seek treatment, and a lot of people are reluctant to follow the treatment. What do you mean I have to eat like this? I've had patients who have had, they know they're a diabetic and they're having a shot and a beer at lunch and they're eating whatever they want and they're overweight by 100 pounds. That's a terrible tragedy looking to happen. They're not going to survive. They don't take care of themselves. Simple as that. I'll listen to this. We'll see. I don't recall it.
The sugary snack you devour enters your digestive system and is broken down to simple sugars like glucose. Glucose enters the bloodstream, causing an increase in blood glucose levels. But various mechanisms bring blood glucose back down to its normal level, the set point. This is an example of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. Hormones produced by the pancreas regulate blood glucose levels. Let's zoom in. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose molecules leave the blood and enter beta cells in the pancreas. The beta cells respond by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin enters the bloodstream and is transported to cells all over the body. Let's see what happens in the liver. Insulin binds to receptors on liver cells. This causes the cells to take in more glucose. Inside the liver cells, glucose is converted to glycogen, a storage molecule. Blood glucose levels decrease as glucose is taken up by liver cells and other body cells. As a result, less and less insulin is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. This is an example of how negative feedback maintains homeostasis. What happens if you've skipped lunch and your blood glucose levels are low? Let's zoom into the pancreas again. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells in the pancreas release the hormone glucagon. Glucagon enters the bloodstream and acts on target cells in the liver. Glucagon binds to receptors on the liver cells, signaling the liver cells to break glycogen down to glucose. Glucose is released. And blood glucose levels increase. As a result, less glucagon is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. In this way, two hormones with opposing effects allow the body to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In diabetes, the body is unable to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed by the immune system, and so no insulin is produced. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, but target cells do not take up glucose. In both types of diabetes, when blood glucose levels rise, cells do not take up the additional glucose, and so blood glucose remains high. This example shows the importance of homeostasis in everyone's life.
right? Very good. And it's a nice little summary of what goes on. I mean, receptors are very, very specific. And so it's not that unusual for them, and a lot of problems break down effectively to irregularities in receptors, and we can change them. Again, overutilization is what we always thought when these folks had very, very poor diets that were carbohydrate laden and very inactive, that over time the preponderance of sugar began to alter the receptors, so they didn't work as efficiently and eventually deteriorated or won't work. So there's a lot of theories around behind it. We do most of this stuff in repro about this. So the gonads produce steroid sex hormones as the adrenal cortex, just lesser amounts depending on the situation that are there. They don't predominate other than, again, having associated with the menstrual cycle, and during pregnancy, that's alteration. We'll go into their roles. Estrogen, an important part about reproductive maturity, secondary sexual characteristics, progesterone, again, perhaps a little bit more if you want it, probably affects the uterine lining and the endometrium more about implantation, and probably has a more significant role in the case of fertilization. That's their testosterone, kind of the same deal. Sex drive characteristic, sperm productions, and the placenta obviously assumes this role in the case of pregnancy, in the case of fertilization with implantation. There are some others which we deal with. We'll deal with leptin a little bit. That's released by fatty cells and does play a role with regard to appetite control, some resistin and adiponectin. Again, playing a role as we begin to understand sort of the fine tuning about insulin, but not that relevant for us. And then we'll deal with a lot of these GI related hormones, because more appropriately, particularly gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin, which play such an important role in sort of making sure our digestive system works. Gastrin at the stomach level, secretin and cholecystokinin in the small intestine level. The heart, and it's something I touched a little bit on, it's called atrial natriuretic peptide. You remember, sort of combats aldosterone. When there's too much fluid that's been accumulated, and it basically is secreted from the atria being stretched, and will reduce blood pressure and blood volume. It'll cause sodium to be excreted, and water will follow. We'll talk about this. Maybe you talked about it a little bit in bone, and you should have. Erythropoietin is really has a role on the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. That's why when we get into kidney, why folks with kidney failure, a thing that they struggle with tremendously is anemia. And now we make this erythropoietin, and it's been around for at least, I would say, probably the better part of 40 years as a genetically made, the first genetically made GMO, genetically modified organism. The first substance that was made was insulin. Sort of the history of insulin is such that originally they knew insulin, and they would grind up pancreas originally in pork, and they had pork-based insulin. And again, for a lot of reasons, people religiously particularly, and there were some problems with pork-based insulin with regard to reactions. And then they went to bovine insulin. That was the insulin of choice back in the 60s and 70s. And then in the age of genetic engineering, roughly in 1977, the first genetically engineered product was Humulin, was the name then for human insulin. And so now you had the structure, and you could assemble it in the laboratory, insert it into typically E. coli or yeast. And basically they were genetically manipulated to make insulin. And that's where most of the insulin we use today comes from there. And there's various types that work faster and slower and stuff like that. Well, the erythropoietin, originally, it may have a different name now, it's marketed under something called Procrit. And what it did was because a lot of diabetics, particularly with bad kidneys, were anemic. That was there. And the renin-angiotensin mechanism is something else. And we'll revisit both of these again in kidney. And again, osteoblasts make something called osteocalcin, plays a role with insulin, improves glucose handling. sort of co-stimulated by insulin. And as you can see, this is one of the things in type 2 diabetes that they're noticing that particular agent is made. And it's not a big deal for us, but just, I mean, you're exploring this stuff all the time. Vitamin D is activated both in your skin and in your kidneys. Okay. Plays a big role in your immunity, a big role in inflammation, all of those things. I will tell you authoritatively that someone of my acquaintance gave me 3 vitamin Ds to take last night. She typically gives me a small bowl full of supplements, which I have to take. Where else? It's like, here they come. Electrolytes, vitamin B, iron, zinc. Surprised I'm not magnetic. And the thymus will get to the immune system. These are all hormones that play a role in the T cell development process. And that concludes, folks, the material for the first exam. I know you're excited. So I'll do, in the interest of trying to keep your attention, we'll try something else. The blood. To that end, I have loaded, I may be on there in more than one place. The handouts for this are on week 6 that you can see. So as you scroll down, you'll see the blood PowerPoint and where the endocrine stuff is. And underneath all those, where I'm going to stick the next YouTube when I get it set up, is this blood outline. Voila. So again, in an endeavor to make life easier for you, I outlined this chapter many years ago from the same textbook, but an earlier edition, and voila. Pages for your reading pleasure. I try. Yeah, hey, if you want to share it with somebody else who's taking the same course, knock yourself out. Or down the road, or somebody you know comes along after you and is taking the same course. Hey, share the wealth. It's good. My goal, too many people, I say it all the time, there are too many people in fields that measure success not by their own success, but by their own success and the failure of others. Not only is it important for them to succeed, but somebody else has to fail. And I hate that. Can't take it. I want everybody to succeed. Be happy, have a good life, all those things. Even Browns fans, who I felt sorry for, because the guy who got hurt is a really good guy too. Oh, but Ravens fan, but all that stuff. So please share this stuff. Anything I have you, if you want to give them one of my, I'm not proprietary about these things. Okay, I'm there to enhance understanding. So there's a bunch of stuff here. Okay, and we're going to do the whole thing. We'll do blood types. And unfortunately, I have entirely too much information to share with you on this particular topic. Okay, so it's another one of those ones I have a lot of information to share with you, thankfully. So here we go, the blood. It's a connective tissue. What makes a connective tissue? Cells, got an abundance of those, red cells, white cells, platelets, which are cellular fragments. It's got fibers. The fibers are dissolved in the solution of the blood. It has a ground substance, which is liquid. So the combination of the dissolved fibers and the ground substance make up the matrix, which is liquid. Why does blood clot? Because a series of factors cause a structural change in those dissolved fibers. They come out of solution and they form a fishnet that traps red blood cells, and voila, you got a clot. That's what happens. Very simplistic. And blood is so extraordinarily important, and blood products and all of those types of things. And we have a use for all individual types of cells that are harvested, blood components, all of which are very, very valuable today in healthcare. So yes, this life-sustaining transport vehicle, I'll buy that. It moves stuff around. It plays an important part in regulation of all types of bodily functions. And it's basically the way that our white blood cells and a lot of immunological chemicals make their magical way around your body. So it's all those are inherently true. So you can't underestimate it. Most of us have somewhere between 5 and 6 liters of blood, typically. Again, women a little bit less, men a little bit more. It's more proportional to size. Job one, transporting oxygen and nutrients to cells. Waste removal. Wastes go away in a lot of different ways. Wastes are generally processed in the liver, typically excreted by the kidneys, because the liver makes them more water soluble and the kidneys can get rid of them. And the lungs, a certain amount of stuff comes out in the lungs. It's sort of the reason why we talk about the alcohol breath test that people get. They may or may not have administered depending on, if there's a suspicion of driving under the influence, that there's a fixed percentage of alcohol in your bloodstream that is expelled in your lungs, and it's about one out of 2,000 parts. But that's enough to get a read and be able to sort of extrapolate into your blood level. Well, hopefully none of you will have that experience. All I could think of is my daughter and her fiance. They Uber everywhere. For just that reason. Trust me. I bet she was at the game last night. I'm just guessing. It's inherent wrong. They're at the game last night. My oldest, is on a cruise for his 10th anniversary, going to the Bahamas. What's wrong with this picture? My sister went to 21st, 2 days, is leaving 3 weeks in Europe. I'm here with you. I mean, at least I have my wife and the dog are there to keep me company. And you guys. It's not fair. Okay. So body temperature by absorbing and distributing heat, blood flowing to areas or not flowing to the areas, a tremendous amount of importance with regard to maintaining the pH, and buffers are extremely important. It allows us the luxury of being able to deal with, like we talked about acidosis before and ketoacidosis. That's an extreme and it overwhelms your compensatory mechanisms. That's why it becomes significant when you have a diabetic out of control. For most of us, if you do a workout and you have a transient amount of acidosis, you have enough chemicals in your bloodstream that are able to compensate for that. So problems don't happen. Your whole body runs by temperature and pH, and the blood plays a role. If you remember back when you learned a little bit in AP1 about proteins function, the things that denature or make proteins not work, the two most critical factors are temperature and pH. And that's where your blood comes in. It maintains a relatively constant temperature and it maintains a relatively constant pH in a range that doesn't allow a lot of problems. And obviously fluid volume is part of it. Preventing blood loss. This is where one subset of the plasma proteins that participate in clotting factors and the platelets themselves, which contain a lot of those plasma proteins, as well as the dissolved protein, the fibrinogen, which makes up about 4% of all the proteins in your bloodstream, play a significant role in preventing blood loss. And this is where the agents of immunity are carried, whether they're chemicals or cellular, whether they're antibodies, an interesting series of proteins called complement, as you can see, it's spelled with an E to distinguish it from complement with an I, and all those wonderful white blood cells that we will visit. So it's a fluid tissue. That's what's distinctive. Okay, it's I'll agree it's not a living fluid, thankfully. That would be annoying. Okay, so that's the plasma is what we is the fluid component of the blood. And you're going to see in a second how we figure that out and the relative constituencies and why it's so important. Cells, and we call them formed elements. Because the only true cell in the bloodstream is the white blood cell. That's a cell that has a nucleus. The red blood cell has matured to a point where it's shed its nucleus and it's just designed almost exclusively for carrying oxygen. And platelets are nothing more than fragments of cell membrane with protein granules in them. And it's a suspension. What it means is that as long as the blood is moving, you might remember studying this because it's in the textbook in AP1 that you have things, that you have solutions and suspensions. So what's a suspension? As long as it's moved around. So you're at home and you're making a salad and you have that Italian dressing, not the creamy, which is an emulsion. That one you got to shake, right? So what happens in the refrigerator? Right? The oil and the liquid are separated. Okay? So what do? You and you put that on your salad or you make it yourself. It's effectively what a vinaigrette is temporarily suspension. Once it stops moving, and that's what happens if you take out a tube of blood out of your arm in a test tube and put it in a test tube rack and walk away and come back a couple of hours later, the red blood cells will settle to the bottom because they're heavy because of gravity. So it will no longer be suspended. That's what a suspension is. Okay? So as long as it's moving, the cells are suspended in the plasma. The erythrocytes, this means red cell, and we do call them RBCs, but again, formed elements is the better term. White blood cells, not because they're white, because they're not red, so they call them leukocytes. And platelets, again, the fragments. And so this is what they're talking about. I'll flip. So about twice a year, you've been here long enough, in that gym over there, the old John Jay gym, you have a blood drive, right? Seen it? Maybe you donated blood there, all that stuff. That's there. This is what they do. Now, they're not necessarily doing it the same way as this, but this is how you analyze it. So when you take blood, whether you put it into a test tube, whether you withdraw it with a syringe, or you go directly into one of those bags that they're collecting it in when they're doing a blood drive here in the blood bank people are in town, the way that they are able to utilize the products is to separate them. And it's very easy to separate them without injuring them. And that's, as I told you about, if you put that tube of blood and let it sit there, you'd get to that. But to make it happen faster, you use a centrifuge. And the whole idea of the centrifuge is the heavier stuff goes to the bottom when you spin it. It's like, Kennywood rides, Well, my kids always made me sit to the outside. I was that dad. Children. They knew I got sick from those rides. Roller coasters all day long, no problem. But the spinny rides, and they see me turning green, and they go, "Dad, let's go over and get French fries." Jeez, it's like, and they're looking at me, gobbling stuff up, knowing I'm going to just throw up in the side. The same children going on cruises, going to games. Did they invite their old dad? No. None of you would be like that. Okay. Nevertheless, here's what happens. It separates. The supernatant liquid, a chemistry term, is the plasma. That's all the water and the stuff dissolved in the plasma. And we'll utilize that because we can extract things from it. The red cells go to the bottom. The relationship is roughly 55 to 45 normal. There's a thin layer. Buffy coat means that it has like an off-white color. The platelets and the white blood cells are in that area. It's usually fairly negligible by volume. It's rather small. The relationship of these two numbers have a very famous name that you will hear. Okay, so the percentage of, this is a cylinder, all you have to do is measure it. If this is 2 inches, and this would be an inch to here and another inch to here, it would be 50-50, right? Because it's a cylinder and it's uniform. So the length effectively. So what we do is we measure the distance from the bottom to the top and then the distance here. and we create a ratio. So the percentage of red cells by volume, that's how you would do it, over the total volume is a very fancy name. So in this case, 45% red cells over 100%. That number is called the hematocrit. You work in a hospital or in healthcare, you'll hear the term hematocrit, often referred to as crit. We can approximate the hemoglobin, and you can do finger sticks for that as well now, by dividing by 3 that number, in this case 45. So you can approximate the hemoglobin. And so what they'll do in the hospital, particularly the patient who has anemia, getting transfusions, those kinds of things, about every other day, they'll order what's called, and you'll hear the term H&H, hemoglobin and hematocrit. You don't need to redo an entire blood panel because it's cost effective. And that plays a role. So back up. So you spin the tube. Typically, red blood cells 45% by volume. Okay, the hematocrit is that percentage that's red blood cells. There is a wide range. So typically in men who, because of testosterone and the absence of menstruation, typically have a higher proportion of hematocrit. So the range here by these numbers would be roughly 42 to 52. The range here would be 37 to 47, proportionately less, not dramatically so. Most of the time, a lab normal, and if I'm on my game, I'll show you mine, all my blood tests that are there. Typically, if the range for most labs is maybe as low as 12 and as high as 17. It depends on the lab. The ones I have will be on my UPMC, if I'm thinking about it, and I should, I'll probably get that together for you next time. Okay? So here we go. So the white cells and the platelets, less than 1%, and the supernatant liquid, the stuff on top, the plasma, 55%. So this is the nature of blood. We all know that. If you prick your finger, do that. It has a metallic taste. That's the iron. It's inherently very sticky. It goes through everything rather quickly. You have a layer of gauze pads stacked like that. Put a drop of blood. It'll be red all the way to the bottom. Very quickly. If you put an equal drop of water, only the first few will be wet. It slides through pretty efficient. If you there's an old saying, if you took a gallon of water and a thimbleful of blood, you would turn that gallon red. It doesn't take a lot to make that profound reddish color. Depending on the individual, if you go to the lab, they'll actually be able to look at the blood they're pulling out by venipuncture and be able to tell an idea of what the blood looks like, how well it's oxygenated. So they can tell if it's very dark, if it's very distinctly reddish, if there's a pale kind of a color to it, if it's particularly low, it might even be in that level. That's there. The pH is consistent, and that's a range, where pH is a logarithmic expression. Okay, so it's a log power of 10, 7.35 to 7.45. So pH of 7 is normal. It's neither, if we look at neutral, not the word normal. So it's neither acidic or alkaline. Your blood, because of all the constituents, is very, very slightly alkaline or basic. And because it's logarithmic, that's a big number. I mean, these are all going from a pH of 7 to 6 is a factor of 10 times more acidic. So when you're dealing even with small numbers like that, it's significant. And again, proteins, if your blood goes to 7.33, you are dangerously acidotic. Enzyme and hormone systems are going to shut down. 8% of your body weight, and again, 5 to 6 liter in men, a little bit proportional less. The plasma is usually, straw is a good term, slightly yellowish, mostly water, tons of stuff dissolved in it, whether it's nutrients, gases in water dissolve. So there's a certain amount of oxygen, a certain amount of carbon dioxide, a certain amount of nitrogen, all the stuff, the air that we breathe in a gaseous form is in there proportionately. Waste products, chemical mediators like hormones, proteins are inherently water soluble, and inorganic ions. So the calcium, the sodium, the potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, all of those are ionic substances, charged particles, which by definition are water soluble. So we look particularly at the proteins. They're the big players. And they're so large they can't get into the cell. So you saw in that animation, the insulin's a big protein. Okay. It can contact a receptor on the outside of the cell and cause things to occur inside of it. Can't get in the cell as long as the cell's intact. So they're not taken up by the cells. They're made in the liver. Collectively, we refer to albumin as approximately 60% of those proteins. That accounts for this. Eraser, future. Not present. Colloid osmotic pressure. We'll get to that in a couple of different sections. What proteins do is they hold water. Milk is a colloid. When milk spoils, okay, it clumps up, hurts and way thing. Okay, buff it, tough it, spider, cider. It's not monkeys jumping on the bed, but what is? So you have when milk denatures, it separates. Okay, and that's sort of probably when they cheese that. So what happens here, as long as we have that albumin in our bloodstream, it holds water. And what it is, a force that holds water in our bloodstream as opposed by our blood pressure. Because blood's going around in a tube, full of blood vessels, like so, right? Hollow tube. So the force of blood pressure pushes the fluid against the tube. There are little holes. The vessels get smaller, it should extrude out. The reason it doesn't all extrude out is because the proteins are pulling it back. So they oppose each other. When you get to the capillary level, the blood pressure and the colloid osmotic pressure are sufficiently close that the blood pressure overwhelms it and pushes it out. And then eventually the process reverses itself to pull back in waste products. Albumin. So how do we know if somebody has a problem with that? If you see somebody with liver disease, they look extraordinarily bloated. That's not fat, that's fluid. Because they don't make albumin, the fluid pours out of them. You see war-torn countries with little kids with spindly arms and legs, no muscle, no protein, big swollen bellies. Okay? That's fluid that's coming out of the blood vessels. It's called, as a fancy term, it's called ascites, A-S-C-I-T. So that's one of the gifts. You see somebody waiting a liver transplant, they look like that. So I mean, it just gives you an idea of the importance behind this. We're basically just about done. So does it play? It carries other stuff with it. It plays an important. That's a protein that helps to buffer the blood to keep the pH relatively consistent, and the plasma osmotic pressure. And it gives you a whole laundry list. We'll stop here, and then we'll look at the globulins and the fibrinogen and the other stuff that's in it on Thursday, and we'll figure out, and like I said, we'll probably use some technology in lab. Thank you. Bingo.